In this region, we're going to focus on how Northern Eurasia is a unique region based on its human factors and physical factors, including climate, vegetation, language, trade networks, political units, river systems, and religion. So let's start with the climate of the region. Obviously, when we think of Northern Eurasia, predominantly Russia, we think of the cold. We think of Siberia, the polar climate, and we do have a very cold climate, and really continentality, one of our climate factors. Position on the continent is a major factor where there's not a lot of access, or since they're not as near to water, we have extreme warm temperatures and also extreme cold temperatures. And in terms of climate, the northern portion of the region, normally the Arctic is frozen much of the year, which has historically affected how Russia has tried to get access to areas like the Black Sea, the Baltic, and so that's important to remember. So a lot of subarctic areas. The deserts in Central Asia are also important because when we think of the region, we often forget about those countries like Kazakhstan, for example, that have large areas of desert. The vegetation, forests, we've looked at these in terms of Europe. Taiga, for example, is one of the coniferous forests. And so along the northern area of Russia, predominantly, we see these type of forests. We see tundra again. We've looked at it in terms of Europe and North America, so it's very similar in terms of those climates. The steppe, though, these are the grasslands that we find, the prairie or steppe in this area. This is where the Mongolians traveled and became controlled much of Asia and even entered into parts of Europe and affected Russian history. And so these steppes have been important. This is where we find a lot of the nomadic herdsmen still in the region today. This language map is unique because if you look at Northern Eurasia, it's almost all green or Russian. The reason for this relates to the fact that this region was dominated by Russia when it was part of the Soviet Union. So even though some of these countries were different linguistically, when the Soviets took over those areas, they forced them to learn Russian. So Russian is still a very strong language in many of these countries. Kazakhstan is interesting because the majority of people in Kazakhstan are not ethnically Kazakhs. They're actually Russians. And so that's why we see such a large amount of Russian speakers. In some of the areas in Siberia, some of the tribes people or the native in those areas, their languages have actually become extinct or threatened because Russian is such a dominant language and has been used to dominate people. Some of the trade networks in the region, we're going to go way back to one of the historical trade routes, particularly through the Central Asian area, the Silk Road. So we look historically, this region has been interconnected. And then predominantly the European regions of Russia are more interconnected to the global economy. But the way the global economy is today, it's hard not to be connected. The political units, first of all, keep in mind that all of this area at once was part of the Soviet Union up until the 1990s. Russia is the major dominant country in the region, and we see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even pockets of Russia. We have the Kaliningrad exclave, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and also these Caucasus regions, the Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the areas in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Many rivers in the region. Some of the major, we talked about the Volga in terms of Europe. The Lena is a major river. Several of the rivers that enter the Aral Sea we'll look at in terms of how humans have changed the physical environment. So the Amudarya, as an example, is a river that's important. And in terms of just bodies of water, we could even say Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in the world, is an important one. I mentioned in climate, the Arctic Ocean, even though there's a lot of water, much of it is frozen most of the year, so Russia does not have as much accessible coastline as we would normally think just looking at a map. The religion, under the communist government, religion was frowned upon, but after the communists fell, we see the rise of Eastern Orthodoxy. The Russian Orthodox Church is one of the examples of that, similar to what we saw in Eastern Europe. There are pockets of Judaism in particularly the western areas, and Islam is a major factor in the Central Asian portions of the region. So when we think of Northern Eurasia, the first thing to focus on is its climate. It is like we would think about stereotypically. There is a lot of cold areas, Siberia, for example, but we also need to remember about the deserts in Central Asia and the fact that much of this portion of that is connected to Europe is similar to the European climates. Vegetation, the same thing. We saw the connection of the forest we've talked about in Europe, tundra, but to remember the steppes in Central Asia. Language, Russian is a dominant language, and as these countries gained independence, many of them focused back on the languages that were spoken there before the Soviets and Russians dominated them. Trade networks, the region, particularly the European portion, is very interconnected globally, and we do see something that wasn't mentioned. Some of these areas starting to be important in producing oil, especially around the Caspian Sea here. River systems, we talked about the Volga, again in Europe, the Lena in this area, and even some of the rivers, the Amur Darya, that feed into the Aral Sea. And finally, religion. Eastern Orthodoxy is dominant in Russia. Islam is dominant in this Central Asian portion. And we see, because it's a shatter belt, aspects of Islam and Christianity merging here in the Caucasus region.